Lesson 17, learning to see the light. Light and exposure are key aspects of photography. How you manage your camera's exposure settings will determine a lot about the quality of your photographs. Learning to see the light and understanding how your camera will record both the brightest and the darkest part of a composition helps you to know what will make a good photograph even before you bring your camera up to your eye. There are two main types of light that you need to be aware of. There's hard light and soft light. Hard light comes from usually a very bright and relatively small light source and casts hard-edged shadows. Soft light is diffused and casts a softer edge shadow or sometimes no shadow at all. The sun on a cloudless day gives us hard light. On a cloudy day, the light is diffused, the light rays are scattered, so the sun gives us soft light. The type of light illuminating a subject you want to photograph will determine a lot about the outcome of that picture. It will also affect the camera's exposure settings when you set to any of the auto exposure modes. The reason your camera will not always give you a good exposure is because it's got limited ability to record the highlights, the brightest parts of an image, and the shadow detail, so the darkest parts of an image. This is most noticeable in hard light where the contrast is high, where the highlights are very bright and the shadows can be very dark, like in the middle of a cloudless sunny day. On cloudy days and in other situations where the light is soft, it's much easier to get an evenly exposed image because the contrast is not so high. Soft light creates a lower contrast scene, so it's much easier for the camera to record detail in the brightest and the darkest parts of your composition. Plus, our eyes are able to see a much broader range of tonal detail than our cameras are currently capable of. Our eyes are also constantly adjusting to bright and dark areas. So what you photograph with your camera will often look very different than what you see with your eyes, particularly in hard light. Because our cameras are more limited in the tone range they can record, this is why it's important to be in control of your exposure settings. When a scene is lit by hard light and contains both very bright highlights and very dark shadow areas, you need to make a choice where you're going to expose for. You're going to expose for the highlights or for the shadows, because your camera often will not be able to record detail in both of those areas. Or you can expose for in the middle, so set your camera to auto and then your camera will decide how to manage the settings to give you a very generic, often a very flat looking exposure. To be able to manage your exposures well, you first need to be able to see the light and discern the contrast level in a composition. So when you're taking photos, pay attention to the contrast in the scene that you're photographing. When there's low contrast and the tone range is much more even, it's much easier to get a well-exposed image. And when the light is hard and the contrast levels are higher, the tone range is greater, you'll have to be much more careful with how you set your exposure. When you're taking photos and you want everything in your composition to be evenly exposed, soft light is going to produce the best results. And if you want a more moody photo, choose hard light. Using hard light and understanding contrast, you're able to get your subject looking well exposed against a dark background and the dark background appearing black or almost black, just because of the contrast level involved and how your camera manages this. In any situation where you've got the sky in an image behind your subject, whether it's hard lighting or soft lighting, your subject will often be underexposed using any of the auto modes. We looked at this in the previous lesson, but it's good to understand why this is. And even though the lighting may be relatively low contrast, the sky will often be much brighter than your main subject is, and therefore you need to be much more careful with your exposure settings. Lesson 17, practical exercise, learning to see the light. This exercise will help you learn to see the light and make better choices about your exposure settings. For this exercise, choose a medium-toned subject and a darker toned subject. I'm going to use this old slide projector and an old camera. so that I've got a nice tonal difference, but one that's not too bright, but one that is quite dark. Set your subjects up in the shade, somewhere that it's quite evenly lit with nice soft lighting. And with your camera set to aperture priority, take a few photographs. Then take your subjects somewhere you can photograph them in full sun. Now look at the brightest areas of your scene and adjust your exposure compensation so these areas are looking really good, not overexposed. So I'm dialing my exposure compensation down to -2 because I'm predicting that will be right for this area here of the old slide projector. That's the brightest part. Then check the photos you've taken and make sure that the amount of exposure compensation you've dialed in is good. Mine's a bit too much, so I'll dial it back to -1 and try again. That looks better. Then look at the darkest area, for me that'll be my old black Nikkormat camera, and dial in your compensation so that the darkest part of your scene is going to be well exposed. So I'll set mine to +1 to start with. That's looking pretty good. And always when you're using exposure compensation, don't forget to reset it after taking each series of photos. Otherwise, you'll be wondering why your photos look over or underexposed when you're photographing in less contrasty conditions. When your subject and the background are illuminated by soft light or that they're all in hard light, you're more likely to get an even exposure. So compare the two different sets of photos that you've taken and have a look for the differences and decide which ones you like better. And don't forget to take some photos using your phone for this exercise as well, and make some good notes about what you're doing. And once you've reviewed your pictures, save 2 or 3 of the best ones to your favorites folder. The main points from this lesson are: light is a key aspect of photography. There are 2 main types of light: hard light and soft light. Cameras cannot always expose the brightest and darkest areas of a photo evenly. Practice this to improve your photography. Everywhere you go, look at the light and think about how it will influence the photos you could take in that place.